Yo, what's going on, guys? It's Jay. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about hip hop. It's the birthday of hip hop today. The birthday of this amazing genre of music, starting way back in 1973. A music that has changed the world. A music that has revolutionized relations with people around the world, brought people together, at times even torn people apart because of its competitive nature. But this was the first music in history where people that were young and people that were impoverished and people that were from the inner cities controlled the narrative of the music, at least at first. People will say, well, rock and roll was controlled by the young people because it was marketed to young people, or jazz was. Not necessarily because in those styles of music, you had to be trained in specific instruments. Rock and roll, you had to be trained in guitars, you had to be trained in drums, you had to be trained in be a good singer. Jazz, you had to be trained in even more instruments, as it were, and with classical, the same thing. With hip hop, because of the circumstances that the urban youth of the early 1970s found themselves in. Keep in mind, this was the Bronx. This was after white flight, after all of the Caucasian residents, or most of the Caucasian residents, had left the Bronx and moved out of the Bronx and moved to the suburbs. What was left of the population was Hispanic people, Puerto Ricans specifically, and African Americans. Puerto Ricans had moved into the Bronx after the 1950s when immigration from Europe was, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when immigration from Europe was banned because of World War II, right? And the fear of communist or Nazi or fascist infiltration. So they needed immigrants, as they always did. So they recruited from America, recruited from its its territory, its Commonwealth, Puerto Rico, and likewise African Americans began to move up from the southern states once again, like they had done during the 1920s, to these urban areas. But this increase of African Americans and Puerto Ricans caused the white residents to move out, and with them came the businesses, went the businesses, and went the money. And pretty soon, neighborhoods like the South Bronx were full of what they call urban decay. Um, Abandoned buildings, gang violence, drugs, because keep in mind, like Ronald Reagan after him, Nixon before him had instituted programs to flood the inner cities with heroin from Southeast Asia. Well, at that time, remember, this was the time when hip hop started. We were still in the midst, where it was about to be over, but we were still in the midst of the Vietnam War. You know what I mean? And during that time, a lot of the CIA collaborated with heavy, big time drug dealers like Frank Lucas, the character featured in American Gangster, to flood, and Frank Matthews, another famous drug dealer, to flood the inner cities with heroin. So the inner cities are flooded with heroin. There's urban decay, there's white flight, and there is nothing but gangs. So with this happening, with richer residents moving out of the area, the government is pulling educational resources, including music programs, from their schools. So young people don't have the opportunities to learn instruments like the trombone, instruments like the guitar, instruments like the drums. They don't have the chances to learn this, but they still have musical talent. So what do they turn to? Is they turn to, at this time disco was popular. Studio 54 was a thing in New York. But these were young kids. They weren't allowed into, especially Studio 54, which was a very exclusive club. They weren't really allowed into that. So what they did was they took turntables, record players, and they began to play them outside in block parties, specifically back to school parties, which is the party which started hip hop with Kool Herc. And now this was a tradition. They started this tradition because they couldn't get into the disco clubs. But initially, Kool Herc, who was a Jamaican immigrant, Jamaicans also coming over to the United States because Great Britain had recruited a lot of Jamaicans in what they call the Windrush after World War II to help build up Great Britain after the war, after it was destroyed. But there were so many Jamaican immigrants that there was a reaction from the Conservative Party in Great Britain. So they blocked a lot of the Commonwealth Jamaican immigrants from going over there. So what's the next best thing that came over here to the United States? And Kool Herc was one of them. And he brought the Jamaican sound system, the dancehall sound system, from Jamaica to the United States. And there was a tradition in Jamaica called the dub tradition. But besides the sound system tradition, which he brought over here, there was the dub tradition in Jamaica, in which a record would be made. Yo, Sean, what's going on? A record would be made and somebody would speak over the record. Uh, Particularly a guy named Lee Scratch Perry would speak over the record. There was a lot of, hey Lisa, what's going on with you? There was a lot of Jamaican DJs that were doing this, and they brought this tradition here to the United States. You know what I'm saying? And this became rap. Now there was early elements of rap in other types of music, ragtime in the 1910s, and elements of jazz. If you go back and look at a guy named Pygmy Markham, he was doing some kind of rap thing, and of course there was scat music that Louis Armstrong was doing in the 20s and 30s. So there was elements of rap music before this, but never before had somebody actually spoken rhythmically on a record. This had never been done, and this was the difference with rap music versus other types of music. Never before you didn't have to be talented. You didn't have to be a talented singer to express yourself, and that was the difference with hip hop. You just take a hot beat and you put it on. And one of the other things that they did that was revolutionary was they took a record like James Brown was popular at the time with hip hop artists, and, a lot of funk singers and heavy funk singers like Parliament Funkadelic, and they would take the piece of the record that you dance at, where there ain't no music playing and there ain't no singing, right? And they would isolate this break, and then they would run it back. And during that time, people would dance to it. And that's where breakdancing came in. That's what they call breakdancing or b-boying. And initially, b-boying at first was a b-boy was a person from the Bronx, because again, this subculture developed in the Bronx. But as hip hop branched out to other boroughs, it became popular in other boroughs as well. And then we developed the 5 elements of hip hop: rapping, scratching, breaking, graffitiing, and knowledge. Knowledge was another one because at this time, it was a heavy politicized time. I mentioned before that there was a lot of gangs in New York at that time. If you watch the movie, like say the movie The Warriors, which came out in 1979, if you watch that movie, you'll see that there's a lot of different gangs in New York. And that was the truth. New York had a heavy gang problem because, again, what we see from today, what we see from Chicago, right? And we hear always about Chicago being the worst place in America as far as gangs and crime. Well, that's how it was in the '70s in New York, because we had the last of the Vietnam War. We had Watergate going on, and once Nixon was impeached in 1972, the president that came after him, Gerald Ford, told New York State, the New York State had asked for New York State and New York City had asked for federal help, and he basically told them to go to hell. So there was no control in the city. You know what I mean? The gangs were taking over. That's just what they show in that movie, and that's what it was in real life. But in 1971, 2 years before hip hop became to be a thing, this this group of young people from all the gangs in the Bronx, New York, it's called the Ho Avenue Treaty. I know it's a funny name because we think of Ho, but the Ho Avenue Treaty, where all the gangs, led by uh, this one group called the Ghetto Brothers, right, decided that they were all going to make a treaty, just like in the movie The Warriors. They were all going to make a treaty and create peace between them. Likewise, one of those gangs, the Black Spades, initially started in the late 1960s by a young man named David Brockton, but led at that time by Africa Bambaataa. They were called the Black Spades. Then they became politicized. They became into politics. They studied a lot of black consciousness, and they changed their name to the Universal Zulu Nation. And when they joined the Zulu Nation, when they formed the Zulu Nation, they started to take a lot of the elements of violence that was plaguing the city and transform it into positivity. Teach the young people to, instead of getting into gang fights like they were with these hundreds and hundreds of gangs, especially in the Bronx, using it towards a positivity, breakdancing instead, graffitiing instead, rapping instead, transforming it into a positivity with the teachings of um, Africa Bambaataa and the Universal Zulu Nation, which was inspired by the Nation of Islam, by the Black Panthers, and by Dr. Malachi York. You know what I'm saying? So that's how knowledge becomes a part of hip hop. And the graffiti part, that was the first part, I would say, the first element of hip hop to gain national exposure, because Michael Basquiat, a famous Haitian American graffiti artist, gained national exposure, and unfortunately, he died a very early death. But at that time, he was the first. He gained the attention of Andy Warhol, because what ended up happening was hip hop was such a dynamic force in New York City, uptown, that a lot of downtown people, a lot of the hippies, and a lot of the punk rockers, and a lot of the hipster people wanted to know about it and wanted to experience it. So they would go uptown and they would look at these graffiti art, these great graffiti art. They were all over the train, all over the city, like big murals. I think it was like Taki 187, actually a Greek American kid who was one of the first to become big. But Michael Basquiat, he transitioned it so much that he began to sell his paintings, and his stuff became synonymous with the new age of hip hop art. So just like rap was transforming music, and DJing was transforming how you make music, the background music, because they weren't using instruments, they were using samples. Um, Graffiti was transforming visual art, and breakdancing was transforming dance art. They took the break dancers took a lot from capoeira, which is a Brazilian-based performance art, and all of that. And you had incredible breakdancers like Crazy Legs of the Rock Steady Crew. This whole crew that they were once a gang and they transformed themselves into a dance crew. So here you had New York in the late in the early '70s for with such negativity, such decadence, such just horrible circumstances, and using this music, hip hop, to create something positive. You know what I mean? You had a lot of five percenters that which was a youth movement started in the mid 1960s by, of course, Father Allah. Um, his name Father Allah, also known as Clarence 13X Smith, with the School Uptown in Harlem. They were heavily involved with hip hop. Many of the original founders of hip hop were either five percenters themselves or influenced by the Nation of Gods and Earths, influenced by their movement. In fact, the b-boy stance, what they came to call the b-boy stance, this stance here, is actually was actually something that five percenters do, what they call standing in their truth or square, when they would recite their 120 lessons. You know what I mean? So a lot of that influence came into what will become hip hop in the early in the early days of it. You know, so and of course the musical traditions that they drew on that they would often break in were African American types of music, soul, disco, funk, but not only that. You know what I mean? They would use like Africa Bambaataa, one of his first hits in 1982 would would be Planet Rock, and that was a sample of a a German electronica band, Kraftwerk. You know what I mean? So, and they would use Aerosmith's "Walk This Way." Like when Rick Rubin first did it with Run DMC, they had said they was used to doing it in parties, back in the day. So they hip hop beat makers and disco, hip hop beat makers and DJs would take any style of music, no matter where it came from, and put it on there. That's how hip hop was bringing people together, and really creating a positive vibe of partying and just having fun. Now, like I said, with the rapping part, that came from a lot of the radio DJs, not just the Jamaican ones, but even the American ones. You know what I'm saying? You had a lot of radio DJs back in the day that would use rhymes to introduce their songs. You know what I'm saying? Chuck Chillout was one of them. DJ Hollywood was one of them. You know what I'm saying? That was just a thing to do all throughout the country. And of course, Muhammad Ali was a huge on that. When Muhammad Ali would do his interviews, he would always rhyme in his interviews. So and he was popular at the time. A lot of young people was drawn on that. A lot of the early MCs. You got to remember that rap back then was very simplistic. They really wasn't rapping about much. Um, Keith Cowboy of the Furious Five is the one who came up with the name hip hop, and then of course it was later used in 1979's the first rap single, Sugar Hill Gang. Hip hop, hippie to the hippie, the hip hop, and you don't stop. Rock it to the bang bang, boogie yourself, jump the boogie to the rhythm of the boogie to beat. See, what you hear is not a test. I'm rapping to the beat. Now, what's funny about that is Big Bang Hank, the man who recited those words, he didn't actually write those words. Words were written by Grandmaster Caz of the Cold Crush Brothers, and he lived in Jersey. And when he was down in the Bronx, Grandmaster Caz had said, he said to Grandmaster Caz, "Let me see your book of rhymes." He took his rhymes and he stole them, basically, and got credit for it on that song. Sylvia Robinson, who was the head at that time Sugar Hill Records, an R&B record label. She gone in the pizzeria where Big Bang Hank was working at, and her niece was already telling her about, this thing called hip hop from across the river that was big with the kids, and she heard them rapping. She put them together, and like somebody said, they were the first real boy band because they weren't completely manufactured by the record company. They was not a real boy band, but they took Chic's record "Good Times" and remixed it, and that's where you get the first uh, rap song ever in history. It's like 3 or 4 minutes long. It's one of the longest songs in history, but it did shoot to the top of the Billboard charts that year in 1979. Now, from there, of course, you have Russell Simmons getting involved, starting with again being a party promoter and helping to sign his brother of Run DMC to a contract in the mid 80s and founding Def Jam Records and taking hip hop to a whole nother level. Now, up until the up until the mid to late 80s, hip hop was completely dominated by the East Coast. Like I said, it came out of East Coast culture. It came out of an East Coast understanding of music. West Coast, down south, none of that was involved. It wasn't until NWA when that began to spread. Now, NWA did not give birth, as many people would think, to gangster rap. Gangster rap actually came about in 1985 with a guy named Schoolie D from Philadelphia when he made a song, PSK, What Does It Mean, about his particular gang, Park Street Killers, in Philadelphia. You know what I mean? So, and that was 1985. Boys in the Hood, this song by NWA, didn't come out until a couple of years later. And while they would think that they made gangster rap famous, or that 6 in the Morning, Ice T's first song, made gangster rap famous, that was not necessarily the truth because here he is referencing gang shit. But they did popularize it. You know what I mean? I got to give them their credit. They popularized cursing in music, and they took hip hop and rap to another level. And for a long while, actually, until Biggie came out in '94, uh, the West Coast was dominant in the rap game. And then Biggie came out in '94, and that changed everything. East Coast completely fell off because East Coast was still trying to stick to the elements of hip hop, still with the Gang Stars, still with the Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, Native Tongue Posse, and all that, while the West Coast had moved on to other things in a more flashier, more gangster type way. You know what I'm saying? And that, of course, caused a beef. You had people dissing Compton, saying Compton sucks, because just like Boogie Down Productions repped the Bronx, or Cold Chillin' Posse with Big Daddy Kane repped Brooklyn, or uh, Run DMC repped Hollis, Queens. NWA came out and they repped Compton, but some New York artists, they took exception. Some East Coast artists took exception to that and felt like West Coast should only dominate. East Coast should only dominate hip hop. Like, for example, Luther Campbell. You know what I'm saying? Who had beef with the West Coast artists, or some people like Tim Dog. Tim Dog is another example. Made this song called "Fuck Compton." because East Coast artists were hating because they fell back. Even great masterpiece albums that we talk about as great masterpieces today in hip hop, like Illmatic, that came out in '94, didn't get no attention in '94 because the West Coast had the game on lock. Then you had the rivalry between Biggie and Tupac, the deaths of Biggie and Tupac in '96 and '97, respectfully. And from there, hip hop changed, moved back to the East Coast, really, because nobody really picked up the ball from the West Coast after Tupac died, and Jay Z took the ball rolling for Brooklyn. And from there, especially in the late '90s, with Cash Money Millionaires and No Limit and Outkast, with their first couple of albums, especially Southern Cadillac Music and Stankonia in the early 2000s, they blew up, and they blew up Southern rap music. You had Southern rap before, particularly the Ghetto Boys. The Ghetto Boys in the early '90s, they were produced by Rick Rubin, but nothing on a big level. It was always West Coast and East Coast dominated. Now hip hop is all around the world. You have artists from Canada, especially Drake, especially Tory Lanez, who's in the news right now, especially artists from Britain. You have UK drill, you have different states, but at the core of hip hop, will always be at the core of hip hop, is New York. Without New York, there is no hip hop because New York created, women are, Lisa saying, don't forget about women of hip hop. Yeah, that's true. Women have always been a part of the hip hop game, going back to Funky 4+1. The plus one was a female. Marley Mon the Juice Crew. They had the real Roxanne, and Roxanne Shan. I mean, they had Roxanne Shante versus the real Roxanne. You know what I mean? Little Kim in the '90s when she was with Junior Mafia, Foxy Brown, Eve, and of course, MC Shyrock. Exactly, Lisa's right. Um, uh, uh, and of course, nowadays in hip hop, you have so many, female artists. I think the female artists dominate over the male artists. Ice Spice, Sexy Red, Glorilla, all these girls. Lauryn Hill, of course. Lauryn Hill of the Fugees. The Fugees changed the game when they came out with their first album in '96 because they were the innovators of what they call alternative rap. Because by this point, once you move from what is called the golden age of hip hop, from like 1980, 87 to like 1980, I mean like 1987 to about 1991. From the release of Follow the Leader, which was Rakim's first album, to the release of Brand Nubian's first album, All for One, in 1991. Once you have the release of, the passage of that going into gangster rap, hip hop splits into different dimensions. And the kind of hip hop that the Fugees were doing in '96 when they came out with the score was different than other types of hip hop. You know, Wyclef was like Rastafarian. He played a guitar. He was heavily into reggae. He was heavily into rock. And Lauryn Hill's lyrics were very conscious. They were very militant, different than you were hearing about from other female rappers, even at the time, which had, by the time hardcore came out in '95, um, uh, had moved, Lil Kim's first album had moved more into a sexual type of lyricism, different than what either MC Light, the Roughneck shit was talking about, and more advanced sexually than what like the likes of Salt and Pepper were talking about. Lisa saying the Brat was the first female solo rapper to go platinum. Absolutely, she started, of course, with So So Def, with Jermaine Dupri. Jermaine Dupri was one of those guys that stepped out of the New York shadow. One of those guys to first bring it to the South. We don't typically associate So So Def with Southern type of music because they didn't really sound Southern. You know what I mean? But absolutely, they were Southern. Goody Mob, another Southern artist, somebody who just passed away this year out of the Memphis area, Gangsta Boo and the 3 6 Mafia, who brought some really crazy shit to the hip hop game. You know, hip hop over the last 50 years has been so diverse, it's given everybody a voice. Everybody from commercial rap artists like MC Hammer to hardcore underground artists like Freddie Fox and Immortal Technique. You know what I mean? From sexy women like Foxy Brown, Lil Kim, and Cardi B to conscious females like um, uh, Lauren Hill and even Rod Digger. From Hispanic people, which is something I want to get into because me as a Hispanic person, I love hip hop. Hip hop is my favorite genre of music. And there's this big discussion about did Hispanic people start hip hop because Fat Joe came. Yes, Lisa saying MC Light is the first woman rapper to release a full solo album, Light Up as a Rock in 1988. Absolutely, the golden age of hip hop. At least, um, there is this discussion. Fat Joe comes out and says the Hispanic people started hip hop, and it was 50-50. Now, I did mention Hispanic people, particularly Puerto Ricans, in the beginning of this video and how they formed part of the nucleus that created the movement of hip hop. But one thing I got to disagree with him on, Fat Joe, that is. Hispanic people did not create hip hop 50-50. That's an outright lie. Not even, you can't even really say that Jamaicans really created hip hop. Yeah, they created the sound system. Yeah, they created the toasting tradition. But as I said, toasting and rapping and talking over records was something that existed in African American, foundational Black American culture since the 1930s, going back even before the 30s to the 1910s. You know what I mean? With ragtime. Sean will find that funny because at one time I didn't even know what ragtime was, and the teacher expected me to know, and I'm a kid in school. Did I know? But ragtime was an early ancestor of jazz, and you could find elements of rapping and talking over music even then in the African American tradition. So, although people say they got it from the Jamaican sound system and the rapping and the toasting, still there's elements of that existed in African American culture. And as far as Hispanics, yeah, they was there. We were there. Hispanics were. There were Hispanic breakdancers. There were Hispanic DJs. Charlie Chase comes to mind of the Cold Crush Brothers, one of the originals. Of course, Crazy Legs in the breakdancing community. Rappers, not really. You know what I mean? Maybe MC Ruby D. Some of the other people, some of the other Hispanic people that look more um, black, you know what I mean, kind of blend in with the crowd. They were Hispanic, people didn't really know, like the real Roxanne, for example, or like I said, MC Ruby D, or the guys from the Fat Boys. But they was doing their thing and they was rapping and stuff and they was in the culture. But Hispanic music did not lend itself to the mix that created hip hop. So they in no way contributed to hip hop. Being a part of it and being in it and imitating other people around you that are African American doesn't mean that you helped to create it. You know what I'm saying? You were just there when it was created. You know what I'm saying? To the point when you look at somebody like Charlie Chase, right? He was a DJ. And he was even saying at that time that his family was upset that he was not in a salsa band and he was not doing Hispanic music. Why was he doing hip hop music? So that doesn't gel well with the narrative that hip hop belongs just as much to Hispanic people as it does to African American people. Because why would his family have a problem with him doing hip hop music and something that wasn't of his culture if it was of his culture, like he claims he and others he and other Hispanics claim that it was. The truth is, there were Hispanics that were part of it, but it was not. It's not a part of Hispanic culture. Hip hop is an extension of African American culture and draws heavily on African American culture and has little nothing to do with Hispanic culture in the 1970s. Was Hispanic culture vibrant in the 1970s? Of course it was. But Hispanics, during that time that Black Americans were creating hip hop, most Hispanics were busy creating salsa music. That's the genesis of salsa. That's when salsa started. Afro-Cuban musicians brought mambo over here to the United States, and because of the communist situation in Cuba, Cuban musicians were banned. We talked about this in the Ricky Ricardo video. They were banned on the Lucy movie. They were banned from making Cuban music. So Puerto Rican musicians that were coming to America at that time created salsa. They took Afro-Cuban music and they mixed it with R&B, merengue, and other different types of sounds, and they created uh, salsa music in the 1970s. Geraldo, the talk show host, even had uh, um, a documentary on it called Nuestra Cosa, our thing, our Latin thing. So they were busy creating that. They were busy with the Fania All Stars, Celia Cruz and Willie Colon and Hector Lavoe and people like that. They had nothing to do overall with hip hop. You know what I'm saying? Even in the 90s, in the early 90s, Latino artists didn't want anything to do with hip hop. In the late 80s, freestyle came out, and freestyle was kind of a mix of Afro Latin beats and R&B music, and it was like it was in English. The lyrics were in English, but still, that had nothing to do with hip hop. They didn't start claiming hip hop really until hip hop became mainstream. So this idea that Hispanics helped create hip hop, I would like to know as a Hispanic how. You know what I'm saying? And what people are going to come up with, because I've heard these arguments before, what people are going to come up with is oh, Hispanic guy was here, he was there. You know what I'm saying? He created hip hop in this way. You know, he was a photographer, right? This photographer guy that was Puerto Rican, or Charlie Chase, the DJ, or this guy was a breakdancer. Yes, but they did it later. African Americans were doing it first. It's a part of African American culture. It's not a part of Latino culture. Hip hop. You know, you know what I'm saying? They was around it. They lived around it. They adopted it. They took to it, but it's not a culture that they created. That's just a reality. You know what I'm saying? That's like, I mean, that's like I enjoy eating Indian food, but I'm not Indian. You know what I'm saying? I love Indian food, but I'm not. That doesn't make me Indian. If I went out and brought every Bhangra, which is a music in northern India, in the Punjab region, if I went out and brought every Bhangra song in the world and became an expert at Bhangra music, that doesn't make me Indian. You know what I'm saying? That doesn't mean that I, in any way, or me or other Latinos, contributed to hip hop. I mean, to Bhangra music. Bhangra as music is still an Indian style of music. It still comes out of Indian culture, Indian history. It just is what it is. You know what I'm saying? I don't know why this narrative, and I can understand why foundational Black Americans are so angry and upset at these Latinos like Fat Joe coming in and saying that Latinos created hip hop 50-50 when you know that isn't true. Back in the day, there was so much racism in the Hispanic community towards African Americans, let's be real, that they didn't even want nothing to do with hip hop. They didn't want anything to do with it until it was starting to blow up, similar to how white people felt about rock and roll in the 50s. You know what I'm saying? In the 50s, they didn't want nothing to do with rock and roll until rock and roll started blowing up. You know what I'm saying? So cut that out. You know what I mean? That Latinos creating hip hop 50-50, that's just bullshit. You know what I mean? That has no foundation in history. And even, yeah, it's Fat Joe mainly, but if you believe me, Lisa, there are tons of videos out there of Latinos claiming that they helped create hip hop 50-50. Not individual Latinos help create hip hop, that all Latinos help create hip hop. When that's not true. You know what I'm saying? Generally, the Latinos that grew up around African Americans, were friends with African Americans, was interested in African American music, spoke more English than Spanish, was a part of hip hop. You know what I'm saying? But the ones that wasn't a part of hip hop. They didn't, and their culture, the Latino culture, didn't contribute to hip hop in any way. At least not in New York. Now the West Coast, the Chicano culture, the Mexican American culture, with the gangs and with the lowriders and stuff. Some rappers became, rappers did adopt that. That did become part of the street culture that embodied West Coast gangster rap. That's true. But thing is, they have their own lane. You know what I mean? Mexican rappers like Swifty Blue and all that, the Serranos, they have their own lane. They don't really try to. Well, really, they can't, especially if they're heavily involved with the gang politics over there. They really can't involve themselves with African American mainstream hip hop, so they have their own lane. They have their own subgenre of music. You know what I'm saying? Of things, cultures, and ways of life that they created and they originated. You know what I'm saying? And Latinos here have that too, reggaeton, which of course we know reggaeton, which is an extension of hip hop in the Caribbean, comes from black people as well, particularly black Jamaicans who built the Panama Canal in the early 1900s when Panama separated from Colombia. They brought reggae over there and translated reggae into Spanish with the DJ. Again, it started with a DJ, Vigo C. So, long story short, Latinos did not create hip hop 50-50. Were there influential Latinos in hip hop? Sure. But there was influential white people in hip hop. Rick Rubin, the Beastie Boys, um, Blondie, even who created Rapture, was one of the first mainstream songs to put Fab Five Freddy and other rappers, in her videos. You know what I'm saying? There was a lot of influential Caucasian people in hip hop. That doesn't mean that hip hop is a Caucasian art form. Hip hop comes out of the unique experience of African Americans and African Americans alone, and that's just the truth. Because people talking all that shit about being woke and everything, and I don't agree with everything woke people say. I come out against wokeness every day. You know what I'm saying? But it just is what it is. You can't try to claim ownership of black music like they did in the past, like they did with jazz, like they did with rock and roll, like they did with every style of black music in this country. You know what I'm saying? try to be a culture vulture and try to say that you have ownership over something you have no ownership over. Why should Latinos do that? Latinos, we have our own style of music. We have reggaeton, we have bachata, we have merengue, we have salsa, we have the Mexicans have Tejano music. Okay, Lisa is coming with a lot of Latinos in hip hop. Yeah, there's a lot of Latinos in hip hop, Lisa. I'm not saying there isn't. Angie Martinez, Nori, Kid Frost. Kid Frost, the first Latino in hip hop, really. Well, Mellow Man Ace was really the first Latino in hip hop, really, with his Mentirosa track. But Andrew Martinez, of course, a radio personality. Nori is half Latino, and he, of course, in the mid 2000s, mixed rap with reggaeton. And Lisa's correct, but there's a lot of other people that people don't know about. Az is Dominican. Fab is half Dominican. You know what I'm saying? So the Beat Nuts, don't forget about them. So Latinos contributed a lot to hip hop, contributed a lot to hip hop, but did not help create hip hop. That's the point I'm trying to make. I'm not putting down my own people and saying, oh, we didn't have nothing to do. We didn't have nothing to do with hip hop or anything. We had a lot to do with it, but we didn't help create it. We were part of it. You know what I'm saying? Just like every other race is a part of hip hop. You know what I'm saying? In some way. You know what I mean? That's just what I wanted to say now. Lisa says she thinks Left Eye was the first rapper in an R&B group. I don't know about that, Lisa, because Bobby Brown used to rap sometimes when he was in New Edition, maybe a female, but he never rapped full time. See, that was the thing. R&B, when hip hop first emerged on the scene, R&B was already established. And a lot of the record executives of black record labels at that time, particularly Motown, which was like the vanguard of. Lisa says, "Do I really consider Bobby Brown a rapper? No, come on. No, I don't. But I'm saying he rapped, on his songs. You know what I'm saying? New Jack Swing with Teddy Riley was a way to kind of blend hip hop and R&B together because R&B, when hip hop became so popular, R&B was almost dying, especially in the early '90s. Because in the beginning, like I said, when Motown was out, this was way before Berry Gordy, the founder of Motown, even sold Motown. Uh, they didn't want to deal with rap. They didn't want to have rap artists on their label because a lot of people considered it at that time a passing trend, a passing fad. They thought maybe, oh, it's not going to last more than 10 years, more than 5 years. So they didn't want to sign any major rap artists. You know what I mean? But that's why Russell Simmons and Clive Davis was one of the first to give Run DMC their opportunity. You know what I'm saying? With their particular style. But as far as the black labels that were dealing with African American music, like Stax, like Atlantic, like Motown, like uh, some of the ones out in Philly, they weren't going to give rap any chances because they felt it was a fad that was never going to last. But by the time the early '90s came around, R&B artists had no choice but to adapt and to get with the times, and they started adding rap tracks to their songs. They started becoming more modern. Yeah, and by the time Mary J. Blige comes around with her first album, she starts featuring rappers on her songs, and she's produced by P. Diddy. Andre Harrell and P. Diddy really helped change that. You know what I mean? And as we stand now, hip hop and R&B are basically indistinguishable. Rappers are singers and singers are rappers. And it was even the case with rock and roll. With rock and roll, of course, in the beginning, antagonistic towards hip hop, thinking that hip hop wasn't gonna last, seeing it as a real competitor. And then when Run DMC came out with Walk This Way, and later on in the late '90s, you had bands like Korn, bands like Limp Bizkit, bands like Kid Rock, people. Even though Beastie Boys was kind of the first to do this in '86 with License to Ill, um, blending rock and rap together to the point where you had the magnum opus of what I consider the best version of that, Linkin Park's Hybrid Theory in 2001, a blending of not only hip hop and rock, but hip hop, rock, and electronica with with their uh, with their DJ, Mr. Han. So basically, all styles of music have been influenced by hip hop. Hip hop has been featured on the um, Super Bowl 2 years ago with Snoop Dogg Crip walking across the stage, being the most famous Crip in all of Southern California. It's all over the world. You even had the hip hop musical Hamilton. You had hip hop in movies, of course. Hip hop in fashion with FUBU and hip hop everywhere. It's really something that's changed the culture and has revolutionized the culture. And really, there's no getting away from it. You know what I'm saying? All starting from people like Grand Wizard Theodore, Grandmaster Flash, Africa Bambaataa, Kool Herc, and Coco Rock to where we are now. Anyway, peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love you.